via the chat. This is intended to be an interactive presentation, so Jackie may prompt you and ask you questions and ask for input as we go along. So we'll do our best to monitor questions during the presentation, and we'll also be trying to save a little time at the end for questions and answers. I'd like to remind everybody to accommodate our families whose primary language is something other than English. We've enabled language translation via the captions option in Zoom. So there's more information about language translation and captioning on the District 47 website on our calendar. And now, without further ado, I'd like to introduce our guest speaker, Jackie. Jackie Rhew is a clinical consultant, keynote speaker, and co-founder of the Center for Emotional Wellness in Crystal Lake and Arlington Heights. She's authored several books and publications, including School Refusal in Children and Adolescents and Successful Parenting, Create Your Custom Plan for Raising Independent Children into Adulthood. Jackie is also the co-host of the Successful Parenting podcast. Welcome, Jackie.
Thank you, Denise. It's always fun doing these with you. And welcome, everyone. Tonight is a topic that I speak to a lot, and so I'm excited to have this conversation. Feel free to ask questions in the chat. Feel free to leave comments. If there's things that are really helpful for you or you have resources to share, we are open to that as well. You can chat privately just to me so no one else will see it, and I will know that that's something I can touch on, or you can feel free to use the chat where everybody can see the comments as well. And so this topic is one that I speak to a lot to parents as well as to different school districts in terms of helping their staff as well. I think our children are dealing with stress and anxiety, but as adults, many of us are too. So we're going to talk a little bit about it tonight. I have quite a bit of information to share. Feel free, take what's helpful for you and leave the rest. You are going to be able to see this video later, but by no means is all of the information necessarily going to be helpful for you. And every family is different. And so there might be some things that I suggest that you might feel like, okay, that's not so helpful for me, where other things you might be like, wow, this really hits home. I've worked with thousands of families and school districts, and this is a topic I've learned a lot by working with fellow parents as well as some of my own parenting experience. And so, like I said, feel free to make comments and ask questions. I always like you to get a feeling for who I am. I have two children myself. They are both adults now, out of college. And so a lot of what we're going to talk about tonight really has related to me as a parent. And I know firsthand when we talk about things like parental anxiety, which we're going to get to, how much my anxiety would spike when my children were struggling, when my children were in distress, or when they were having a tough time. That would kind of trigger that kind of anxiety for me. And so we're going to touch on that. Like Denise said, I have the Center for Emotional Wellness. We're a team of about 30 some clinicians now in Crystal Lake in Arlington Heights, and we specialize in working with families. As Denise said, we have Successful Parenting podcast, which we drop episodes from experts all around the country each week. And the other pictures speak to themselves. The dog I adopted in COVID. And much of what I spend my time doing is speaking to parents at different districts. So let's get started. You know, I do this a lot. I have different ones, but I want you to share, and I did a different version of this last time I was with you. I want you just to check in. Where are you feeling tonight on the scale? Like, where are you feeling in terms of your own stress and anxiety? And take a check and then just put it in the chat so I know where you all are at tonight. And one of the reasons we do this is because I think as parents, we wear many hats and there's so many things that we're doing. It's important that we kind of tap into how we're doing. So we got a 5, a 6, a 4, an 8, a 3. Okay, a couple 3s. And it's funny, you know, sometimes it's like, I think today I was actually feeling a little bit like a 4. And so, checking in with myself, I have things I do for each number. I'm glad we are having a 9. That's awesome. We need that 9. I expect you to chat a ton. And you might feel like you fluctuate throughout the day. You might be a little bit of a 5 in the morning, and you might then step into a 2 by around 3 o'clock. I didn't use this exact version when I was parenting my girls, but I would do check-ins with myself just in terms of where I was, in terms of being tired, in terms of being stressed, in terms of being emotional. And I would gauge that. So if I was feeling more like a 5 or more like a 3, I was a little bit more mindful of my responses to them. So we're going to talk a little bit about stress and anxiety in terms of kind of the differences. And, we see that anxiety, the word is used a lot, in the last couple of years, we hear it. Anxiety is not necessarily a bad thing. We are not trying to eliminate anxiety. We're not trying to take away someone's anxiety. Both in reality, stress and anxiety are going to be, they're going to be there. We're going to have to learn to tolerate them. Now, obviously, we don't want someone to be overly stressed or overly anxious, but some stress and anxiety is actually good for performance. We saw this with the pandemic. We know that a lot of our students had a hard time when it was time to transition back to school. And a lot of that is because new can be uncomfortable. And when they were having to do new things again and having to try different approaches, many of the students would tell me it was uncomfortable because they were lacking confidence that they could do those things. So overly stress often, and I'm going to show you on the next slide, stress has a lot to do with external factors, right? Things that are going on in our life, our ability to cope with them, our ability to set realistic expectations in terms of what I should be expecting. I was talking to a freshman this morning, and she was super stressed out because she was struggling in a class, and her expectation was that she wasn't supposed to struggle in a class. And so we kind of talked about that. Her expectations were contributing to her stress. And when we kind of tweaked those a little bit, it helped in turn her stress levels. Anxiety can be a lot about perceived what's going to happen next. Anxious people don't typically worry that everything's going to go well, that they're going to win the lottery. As we're going to talk about, when we have anxiety, we can be in a very heightened state. For many of the students I work with, and I think Denise had mentioned, I helped start the school anxiety program at Amita. And what I found too is one of our goals for the students in the program were really to develop those self-efficacy skills. And out of that, they really needed to start to have some confidence that they could tolerate distress and tolerate stress. So healthy levels of stress, not wanting kids to be, overly stressed with activities, overly stressed with expectations on grades, but also not wanting them under stressed where, they're maybe not doing a lot. They're playing video games all the time. They're isolated in their room, trying to find that healthy level of moderation and understanding that there is no such thing as perfection. Success is truly going to look different for every one of your children. All kids struggle, as you always hear me say. Just because a child is struggling today is not an indicator of their success for tomorrow. I worked with a bunch of middle school and high school kids, and this is what they reported they felt caused them stress and anxiety. So feel free to put in the chat if your children would say that they're stressed or anxious about any of these on here. And this is not like, I'm sure there's more things that are not on this list, but these are some of the main things that kids reported to me. And again, this was a high school and middle school group, but I've also heard these from a lot of the elementary kids as well. Social, for sure. Social is one. Sounds like academic comparison. That's huge. Okay, we got a couple academics. And with that, I would say I see a lot of fear of failure, friendships changing, worry, not being into video games like the other kids, balancing academics and sports. This is helpful when you guys respond, so I can really tailor this. Not feeling anything, stress in the home. And we're all gonna deal with stress, and we can't, as parents, we have a tendency to be hard on ourselves when there is stress in the home. But the reality is we can only control what we can control, and things are going to happen, and there are going to be life stressors, dealing with high emotions of friends. So I think toxic parenting, I think that this is a good list to realize. And one of the things that we're going to talk about tonight is sometimes we can't change situations, but we can't change how we react to them. And so if something is going on in your child's life that is causing a lot of upset or turmoil, there's still ways that you can support your child. Long-term, impact of stress. Obviously, if we're feeling overstressed as adults, if we're not taking care of ourselves, if our children are feeling possibly overly stressed, these are some things that we might see happen. We might see a child have a hard time coping. The more stressed they are, the harder it might be for them to regulate their emotions, right? And that's how we talked about last time as parents. When our children start to really struggle with regulating their emotions, or they get really heightened, those are good opportunities for us to focus on regulating and then trying to lean in and co-regulate with them. We also see that stress can impact their sleep patterns. We see that many children that have a lot of stress also have different digestive issues. Possibly we see IBS, we see stomach aches, we see headaches, difficulty sleeping, sometimes, other medical things that can come up as a result of, our kids not being able to deal with some of the stressors they're dealing with. Decreased feelings of self-worth. You might even notice behavioral issues. One thing that I have found to be true is that our children will gain more confidence when they start to learn they can tolerate discomfort and they can tolerate doing those things that are difficult for them. We talk a lot about our goal is, teaching our kids to be comfortable being uncomfortable. And this really holds true. And so when we look at the difference between stress and anxiety, wanting to help ease the stress if possible. Again, it's not always going to be possible, but really working with our children on regulating emotions and being able to have some healthy different coping strategies. So we're going to talk a little bit about anxiety. Some of the stuff that I'm going to say, you might be surprised at. Some of the stuff and the information, you might be like, I got it, but it's a good reminder. Typically we all experience anxiety in different ways. And it is a word that's been so overused that I try when I'm talking to kids and even adults, I sometimes will use the word uncomfortable. What are things that cause you to be uncomfortable? What are things that cause, you to feel really insecure? I think the premise of anxiety treatment, and anxiety is one of the most treatable disorders. It really does. It goes with, just going to try to mute this real quick. It goes with trying to teach people to be comfortable being uncomfortable. If you all could just mute if you're not muted, that would be awesome. We see when someone is in the anxious state, for instance, everyone on here could probably identify one thing that causes them, to be anxious. When we're in that anxious state, we're going to worry, right? We're not going to worry everything's going to go well. We're typically going to worry worst case situation. It'll never get better. It's always going to suck. Like I said, we don't typically worry everything's going to go well. And we tend to have a lot of thoughts when we're anxious, right? And just because you have a thought does not mean the thought is true. It does not mean the thought is reality-based. We think things all the time. And so the more heightened you become, the more you're going to have those thoughts that are going to reflect anxiety. It's very distressful and it's very uncomfortable. Nobody has ever died from anxiety. Nobody has ever, but it's very, very uncomfortable. So what happens a lot of times, and we're going to talk a little bit about parental anxiety. How many of you can guess? Who can guess what parental anxiety is? Put it in the chat and I will give you $1 million, or Denise will give you $1 million, since maybe not, but if take a stab at what parental anxiety is. Can't leave the house. Okay. And that definitely could happen. Fearing for your kids. Both good answers. Worried about your child. Accommodations, worry for kids. And it's interesting, helicopter parent, always worrying about your child's well-being. Thank you all for putting that in there, because that's helpful. I use an analogy a lot, and this has helped me through my parenting. You think about if we're on an airplane and, I'm the passenger and there's a lot of turbulence, and, you start to get a little bit nervous, and then there's even more turbulence, and you look to the flight attendant, and how do you want that flight attendant to be acting? How do you want them to look? Right? Most of us do not want that flight attendant to start running up and down the aisle, like hugging us and shaking the drink cart in our face and, telling us it's going to be okay. I guarantee you, the more the flight attendant tells us all that it's going to be okay, the more we're going to get anxious. And so it's interesting. Most of us would want that flight attendant to look calm, cool, and collected. And I use that because so often our kids look to us, and when they're anxious and struggling, and when we're going in to reassure them, make them feel better, trying to, over accommodate them, that can actually raise their stress levels. Parental anxiety, exactly what you all said, has a lot to do with reacting out of our own anxiety as parents when our children become anxious. So when our children start to become super emotional, maybe they're experiencing distress, maybe they're anxious, we start to get anxious and we respond to them out of that anxiety versus, what my goal is for my child to be more confident. And I know in order for them to be more confident, they have to learn that it's okay to be uncomfortable. They're not expected to be happy all the time. And I'm going to allow them to be uncomfortable. And I'm not going to rush in and react. I'm not going to respond out of my own anxiety. Rather, I'm going to respond out of my goals. And I'm going to explain that more in detail. This was actually a really hard one for me when my younger daughter was in middle school. I've shared that before. She had, when she would be dealing with anxiety, it would make me anxious when, one of my girls was having peer conflict or was getting bullied or something like that. It would raise my emotional stuff. And sometimes it's even stuff that we dealt with as kids that we're reacting to. But so often when we feel really emotional, when we're responding to our kids, that can be coming from a place that might not be that helpful. And so kind of just identifying, is this more about your own emotional reaction? And it's not even always just anxiety, honestly. Sometimes we have guilt as parents. Sometimes we worry. Sometimes we just feel so deeply for them. So this is a challenge. These are some of the anxiety disorders that we see at our center. And I'm not going to go into detail for all of this just because of time, but, we see general anxiety and some kids are going to have more anxious temperaments. Some kids are going to have more sensitive temperaments. But we see kids that might qualify for, generalized anxiety disorder. We work a lot with OCD, obsessive compulsive disorder. Then we have panic disorders, social anxiety, separation anxiety. There's certain phobias. A lot of kids we see have fear of storms, fear of throw up, fear of heights, which I have a little bit. I do not love heights and roller coasters. Selective mutism is one we see too. And then there's other anxiety related disorders. Just because you have anxiety does not mean you have an anxiety disorder. In fact, most will say that they can relate to having anxiety or dealing with anxiety in certain situations. It's going to come down to kind of the symptoms and how long it's gone on. So if you have any questions about that, feel free, but it is real. When you are really anxious, and I'll say when I, when I went to Great America with my kids, or when I had to go, to Great America as a kid myself, you actually believe that harm might come to you. So mine was fear of roller coasters and heights. To me, getting on the American Eagle would be the worst thing. Like, to me, there's a chance I could die. There's a chance, and somebody probably has died. So, you can stick to that story. I remember I did an exposure with somebody very similar that had a similar fear. And we were standing outside of an amusement park. And I said, I want you to count how many people walk in and how many people walk out. And he said, okay. And he did it. And then we talked about, I want you to start to look at how the people look when they're walking out. And he said, well, generally they look happy. And so we even went into the amusement park and did this exercise. And what happened is, as the boy started gathering evidence, he started looking at, okay, this is the evidence. My fear is that I'm going to die, but I'm seeing all these people coming out that have gone in. So clearly they haven't died. And I'm seeing people come out with smiles. And so it helped him by looking at the evidence. And that's what we do in anxiety treatment. So I want you to use the chat one more time. What are situations that cause your children to be uncomfortable? And one of the ones I hear the most recently is fear of not being successful. New situations, imagined fear, new environments, grades, something new. I like that one. I hear that one a lot. New situations, getting hurt. The new situations one is huge. And struggling to ask teachers for help is huge. Most of the kids that I talk to, and these are kids that don't struggle with anxiety, will say they struggle asking for help, especially if they feel that their teacher doesn't like them, or they feel like the adult, if they're bothering someone. Fear of nightmares, fear of being different. And these are common. And I try to say to kids that all kids, most kids have or can relate. How do you typically respond when your child is anxious? And we've all responded in a way that we're probably not so proud of. I've definitely had moments where I've run around the house like a chicken with its head cut off, and there's definitely times where I haven't responded in the best way. I love that. Try to stay calm, try to listen. Reassure everything will be fine. And that is being consistent and calm. I like that a lot. Support. Do you reinforce avoidant behavior or maintain expectations? So I work a lot with children that have school anxiety, for instance. And so one of the things that comes up when kids are struggling with anxiety, do you have a tendency to kind of not have expectations or lower expectations because they're anxious? When your children are struggling, do you change your expectations in the home, or do you keep them consistent? The reason we're going to talk a little bit about this is kids, when they're struggling emotionally, whether it's anxiety or something else, they do better with routine, like a parent said, consistency and structure. And if you think about a time that you've been anxious, you had a boss that you really didn't know what the expectations were. The boss was okay if you were late one day, but then the next day you were late and the boss got upset. If you really kind of, things always shifted, you would feel very uneasy. And our kids, when they're anxious or struggling with mental health or medical issues, they do better across the board with consistency and structure. That's why a lot of kids go to like PHP programs and different programs, because it's that intense amount of structure. Our kids don't always like it. They're not going to say at first, thank you so much for providing me routine. But you will see that they start to thrive in that environment. And the last one, do you believe your child can manage their anxiety? Do you believe that your child can handle new situations? Do you believe that your child can handle school situations? Do you believe that your child can handle a teacher that maybe says something not so nice? And it's possible that your child may struggle, but just think for a minute, do you believe that your kiddo can handle situations, even though it's uncomfortable. I like that right now, yes, but I fear as they get older, they may not. These are some of the challenging situations that that some of the kids I've worked with have also identified. Typically, when we're doing anxiety treatment, we have our children, and this is even the younger ones through older. I have them circle situations that are they might see as being difficult for them. They might see as provoking anxiety. And then I have them circle all of the different situations that they perceive cause them anxiety or distress. And what we do is we start practicing those situations. We start going through and doing some different treatments so I can show them that they can actually manage those situations. This is one example. We have a lot of different lists depending on what the child is dealing with, depending on the age. But this is one example of, I think this was like a freshman list I made for the freshmen. And these were things that really bothered her. So for instance, she really struggled with speaking in front of others, making mistakes, feeling like the teacher doesn't like her, and disappointing others. And so out of those four, we created situations to practice, because a lot of it comes down to a skill, right? Practicing something new. Practicing doesn't make perfection, but it makes a routine and it makes us feel more confidence, which then in turn is going to help us feel more independent. It's going to develop those self efficacy skills that we talked about in the beginning. So this is going to be what heightens and maintains anxiety. Oftentimes we avoid what makes us anxious. So if I do not want to make any mistakes, I'm going to stay in my comfort zone and I'm not going to really try new things. I'm not going to raise my hand in class unless I absolutely know the answer. If maybe I'm in a sporting team, I'm going to stay in my comfort zone. I'm not going to become real aggressive. I'm not going to do something where there's a chance I might make a mistake. Sometimes I might avoid going to school. Sometimes I might avoid seeing certain friends. Anything that could possibly cause me distress or anxiety, I'm going to avoid. And I might even know how to do or say things to my parents to help me to avoid. I'm going to seek a lot of reassurance, but as we know, reassurance heightens anxiety. Saying things to your child like it's going to be okay, you're the best, it's going to be a great day, you can handle this, kind of going back to the flight attendant, that's going to heighten it, as well as distraction. So what we want to do is we want to work on the expectation that our kids are going to be uncomfortable, and we want them to understand that we're not expecting them to be happy or okay. We want to work with them on learning how to be comfortable being uncomfortable. There was a parent that said to me last week, my child keeps texting me every time they're anxious, and I keep telling them it's going to be okay, and I keep telling them they can handle it, but we just keep doing the same cycle and nothing's changing. And we talked about, that saying, don't try harder, try different. If how you're responding, you're not seeing a result with your child in terms of how they're handling the anxiety, most likely, probably you want to decide to do something different. And when you do something different, it might take 2 weeks of consistency to see the results. So I wanted to kind of spell out what I know a lot of people will ask me about the avoidance. And so when we talk about avoidance approaches can create more anxiety, avoidance behaviors don't solve the problem. Avoidance feeds anxiety. So the more, if you have a child that really struggles answering questions in class and you want the school to not ask them any questions, what happens is the more they avoid, the less confident they become and the more anxious they're going to be when they have to do something. And it's going to go on and on and on. Avoidance will also continue it to grow. The other examples of avoidant coping, again, might be avoiding a social situation, but then we have what's called active coping, right? So we're learning to tolerate the distress. We're learning to start to manage it and sit with it, recognize the physical symptoms you might be having. So I had a child that was really scared of social interactions. And what we did is we practiced really small social interactions in my office with using different coping techniques. We worked on using a little sand timer and just sitting with those uncomfortable feelings. and recognizing that in 1 or 2 minutes, some of the feelings and sensations are going to go down on their own, and focusing on realistic goals. So maybe you have a child that has been avoiding school or anxious about going to school. We don't just throw them in and say sink or swim. We might start with identifying those situations, start with smaller ones that don't cause as much anxiety, and kind of work towards like the higher level ones. Okay, how many of you would say that, and I would say absolutely me too, reassure your children a lot when they're anxious? I know I think most of us would say that we do. And my friend Ashley Senderak, I got this slide and the next one from her because I liked it. Me too. I think it is one of the hardest things. And so this is how to kind of start to look at if you're reassuring your reassurance seeker or if you are reassuring an information seeker. And so typically an information seeker, it's different, right? They're going to ask you the question once. They're asking you those questions just to gather some information. They accept what you say. They're going to ask the right people. They might ask, I love the kids that go home from school and, it was a bad day. My teacher this, my teacher that, but they don't address it with their teacher. And I'm talking about high school and college kids. And so you can kind of get a sense for an information seeker. Now, when we have a child that is more anxious, what we call a reassurance seeker, this is what you're going to see. They're going to ask you the same question over and over. No matter what you say, they're going to keep asking. It's not enough. They might ask you questions so that they feel less anxious. They're looking for you to bring their anxiety down. They might challenge what you say. They might say a lot of what ifs, that will never happen, that will never work. Often asks questions that there's not really even an answer to, and you can kind of see the rest of this. And so when you get a sense of if you have a reassurance seeker, that's when you want to avoid that excessive reassurance. And you might say, how would I do that? And this slide goes to kind of just some examples, right? And there's no perfect science. We're all going to make mistakes. We're all going to kind of feed into it when we shouldn't. Things that you can say to a reassurance seeker, right? I don't know the answer. I don't know if tomorrow is going to be okay. Tomorrow might be really difficult for you, but I have faith you can manage. And sometimes when you have a child that's anxious and they're in that emotional state, talk as little as possible, because the more you talk to somebody when they're in that emotional state, it's just not doing anything but keeping them in that heightened state. You already know the answer to that question. Maybe they asked you 5 minutes ago and they're asking you again, and you can say, it's the same answer as I gave you 20 minutes ago. And you can read the rest of these. I don't need to go over all of them. What you want to avoid saying are things like, everything's going to be great. You're going to be amazing. You're not going to have any issues. Don't worry. Just go do it. Kids with anxiety, they do better with like doses of reality. Like, this might be hard for you, but I have confidence you can deal with it. If your teacher does, really upset you today, what could you do to manage? Who could you find in the school to talk to? What are different things that you could use to cope? And again, I'm going to go back to when I've been anxious myself. This really does work. Somebody telling me if I'm anxious about giving a presentation, someone telling me I'm going to be great 50 times is not going to make me feel less anxious. If anything, it's going to make me more anxious, because then I'm going to say, well, what if they're just saying that? Why are they saying it so many times? Maybe they don't really believe it themselves. And this is kind of the reel that goes on. If you have any questions, feel free to ask. Here is another one. And this is what's called the Family Accommodation Scale. And you can get this online. They have, for anxiety, they have for OCD. And this is just a little bit of a scale that you can take. And, again, as parents, I'm sure I would have probably scored off the chart for some of these. How often do you reassure your child? How often do you provide items needed because of anxiety? And you go through and you score it, and it kind of gives you a sense of where you are in terms of being like a provider of reassurance, right? It's not good, it's not bad, but it can give you a little point to say, okay, I'm going to do things a little bit differently here. Well, and the other one too, how often do you assist your child in avoiding things that make him or her anxious? We're doing that as parents because we love our kids and we want them to feel better. We all do it. It's just about deciding, is what I'm doing helpful? Is this behavior that, I'm responding with, is this helpful in the overall picture? Which of these, if anyone wants to say, is the hardest one for you not to do? I would say number 6 is hard for many. I hear number 6 is pretty hard. Have you modified your family's routine because of your child's symptoms? Have you not done something? Have you done something differently? Have you changed the routine so that it would help the child? So these are things just to think about. And if you have one that you struggle with or that's more challenging for you, feel free to share it. Okay, thank you. I do things to make it easier for my child, and making sure, we want to make sure that it's realistic for our child. We don't want to have like too many like demands. And it was interesting. Thank you. I like that. The reassurance. I listened to a TED Talk and they talked about, what are the first things that you say when you see your child after a school day, right? Don't kind of, how was the test? Who did you sit with? Like kind of firing questions, but really just sometimes asking an open-ended, how are you? What's one thing that happened today that was good and one thing that happened that was difficult? Sometimes after school, some kids just naturally look sad. Sometimes they look anxious. That's just maybe how they are, and I shared last time I had it when my daughter was younger, my older one, and she would look sad. I had a tendency to say, what's wrong? And what I realized is it was kind of feeding into this. And I was sending her this idea that it's not okay to be anything other than happy. And I had to be careful of how I was leaning in. Many kids will say the whole day was terrible. I actually have a little exercise on here that I do with kids. Because many kids, when you're anxious, you are very all or nothing, right? It's either great or it's terrible. And if one thing goes wrong during my school day, then it was a terrible day. So I have an exercise for that I will share with you. And if it's not in here, I will walk you through it. A lot of times, if you've ever gone to a therapist or kind of read up on anxiety treatment, one of the treatments we use a lot is cognitive behavioral therapy. And it really talks about learning to look at evidence, learning to reframe thoughts. And we use that with anxiety treatment hand in hand with exposure response prevention. And many of you know what that is. It's really identifying those things that trigger anxiety. It's identifying, it could be thoughts, it could be situations, it could be all different things. And you start to recognize that anxiety is safe and tolerable. And so-called safety behaviors are not necessary for tolerating anxiety. So I just wanted to give you an example. We're not going to go too much into this. Let's say you have a child who's got anxiety. They're with the therapist. They're working on, maybe they have social anxiety, and maybe they recognize when they're at school, they have a hard time getting to school because they become really anxious, thinking about social situations, knowing how to respond. They're worried about making a mistake. We might work with CBT and really work with them, identifying what their thoughts are, teaching them how to reframe those thoughts, teaching them how to look at the evidence. Meaning evidence are things that actually have occurred. If I feel like my friend doesn't like me, is it just a feeling or do I have evidence? If she said something, can I actually go check in with her and say, hey, you said this? And so these are a lot of skills that we're practicing in the clinic. But an example of an exposure might be having a conversation with a peer, asking a teacher for help, giving a speech to a group. These might not be like early exposures. These might be later on after we practice some other ones, but I just wanted to give you an idea. If you have a child, and I hear this one a lot, that has a hard time ordering in restaurants and you always order for them, and that would be something where you'd want to work towards them learning to order for themselves, them learning to, order, talk to a teacher and things like that. And these are just other ones. Interoceptives are actually exercises that you do, and we're not in person, so I can't do them with you, but I can promote feelings of panic in myself. And if you all do the exercises, I can help induce panic-like symptoms with you. And so there's a series of like 10 exercises. They will accelerate panic-like symptoms. Sometimes we will do them in the office and then have our clients, or whether it's adults or children, sit with those physical symptoms. And we'll talk about, while it's uncomfortable, you can tolerate it. And then we might move to doing those exercises along with an exposure. And a lot of times it really is learning that I can tolerate being uncomfortable. And it will heighten, but it will also go down, most likely after I've done the thing that makes you uncomfortable. So we have that stage where you're in your head and you're thinking, I can't do this. This is going to be terrible. This is going to be awful. You start to really work up. You become emotional. Then you do the thing that makes you anxious. And then those thoughts go down and you feel more relieved. Every time you practice doing the thing that makes you anxious, you're going to feel a little bit better each time, and you're going to slowly start to gain confidence. Wow, I can do things that are hard for me, and I can push through. If you have any other questions, and I know, when I developed a lot of the curriculum at the school anxiety program, I recognized that most of the students that were coming into the program struggled with these 3 areas. They had a hard time tolerating distress. They had a hard time tolerating discomfort. When they would get uncomfortable, they would really kind of start to react. They would avoid, they would, some of them would even escalate. They would seek reassurance and things like that. I also saw many students that would have a lot of anxiety, that would also have headaches and migraines and stomach aches and things like that. So I wanted them to learn how to tolerate distress. And I worked a lot with parents and family members, allowing their children to be uncomfortable and not reacting every time their child was anxious or uncomfortable. And I worked a lot with parents on maintaining their own level of discomfort and anxiety. I worked with the students on being able to ask for help, being able to communicate what they need. So if you have a child that looks anxious, but they're not speaking to you about it, they're not saying anything, we practiced communicating and problem solving. If there's a problem in front of me, how do I deal with it? How do I approach it? I had a second grader, and he had thrown up at a soccer practice. And because he threw up at the soccer practice, he was so embarrassed. He did not want to go back. He said, I cannot go back to soccer. I just can't do it. There's no way I can do it. And we talked about how he could do it because he had gone to soccer practice like 50 times before. It wasn't that he couldn't do it. It was that it was really challenging for him. And there's a shift in language. And I hear a lot of parents say to me, my child can't handle this. They can't do it. There's no way. It's too much. And I think when we start using words like my child's so anxious, my child can't handle, that sends a message to the child. And we see that, kind of go down the rabbit hole pretty quickly. So this was the exercise for those of you that have a child. Ooh, I just lost it. For those of you that have a child that it's terrible, it's awful. 2 things. One, if you have a dinner with them or a meal, even everyone at the dinner table say what's something that went well today and what's something that really sucked, what's something that was okay, what's something that was really difficult. And try to prompt them to say one of each. So when I would get a child or a student that would go to school and they had a lot of anxiety about school, I created this with Robin, she does the podcast with me. And I would have the student at the end of the day write one thing that happened during each period of their day. So one fact, one thing that was true. And so I had this student, and he said, it was a terrible, awful day. I don't want to go back. I had him do this. And, he said, okay, period 1, nothing really happened. I, just sat in my class. Period 2, we had gym. That was actually okay. I didn't like the game though. Period 3, that was not so much. 4, that was lunch. It was terrible. It was awful. I had no one to sit with. I sat by myself. It was the worst day ever. And I had them write one thing throughout the day. And so at the end of that, I had them look at the graph and say, how was your day? And the child said, okay, it wasn't that bad, but lunch really sucked. okay, well, let's problem solve lunch. What are things, and I always say, what are things that you could do, to do something different? And they might say nothing, lunch always sucks. And they might be in that for a couple moments, but then you can walk away. And when they say it again, I noticed you did this, a couple weeks ago, it was really hard for you and you kind of did something different and it worked out. I wonder if you could try that with this. This is good because it puts it in perspective. So when a child comes out and said, it was a terrible, awful day, everybody was mean to me, it was awful. Oftentimes parents then become really sad, they feel really bad, and then they start to think, oh my gosh, no one likes my child, what's going on? Rather than maybe something just really happened during the day, maybe one thing, and a day is full of a lot of different things. I also use this one. I think I shared this last time. And for younger kids, I do a smaller one, but having kids recognize their physical symptoms of what goes on for them, whether it's a 1, 2, or 3, maybe, you start with feeling a little sweaty, then you might maybe have like an anxious thought, maybe your heart starts to race, but having kids recognize that they are going to have physical symptoms and that's okay. And I do this a lot with the athletes I work with too. What are thoughts they might have, feelings, and then we work on coping strategies. Depending on the child's age, helping them to understand, you're not going to use a coping strategy and go from really, really heightened emotional response or anxiety, for instance, to a calm state in a matter of seconds. So a lot of times I'll see kids in schools and they're like, I tried to breathe. I don't feel better, right? So it doesn't work like that. It's about practice, and it's about, and that's where I'll use those little sand timers. You need at least 1 or 2 minutes to even notice. Maybe you're going to go from an 8 to a 7. Maybe you're going to go from a 7 to a 6, but it's going to take some time. And, helping them set the expectation of, if you do these things, you're going to feel better, but it's going to take time. So I know we don't have Uber's amounts of time, as parents, a lot of this is going to start with us too. Many of us have our own stress, our own emotional stuff going on. We're anxious, we just want our kids to be happy. We want our kids to be okay. That is normal. I think, shifting to, I want my child to be happy, to I want my child to learn how to deal with distress. I want my child to be confident that they can face challenges. So when I look forward to that future adult at 24, 25, they can tolerate the stuff that's going to come their way. And we know we can't shield our future young adults from that, but we can help them to learn to problem solve, to do things even when they're not comfortable. So think about your own goals for your child. What is your purpose in your parenting? What do you want for your child? And then, which I often had to do and still do, think about those times that you react more out of anxiety, out of fear, out of guilt, and kind of tap into that and start to reflect on that a little bit. Our children are going to act a lot like us. So when they see us being calm and confident that they can handle things, that's going to impact them. They're going to model, they're going to see how we deal with stress and anxiety. They're going to see how we deal with making mistakes. I had a mom, she was really open to me. And when her child, didn't get a good grade, she reacted and she kept getting really, why didn't you do better? You should study more next time. And it really, the focus became on an outcome driven goal versus kind of working on, how the child got there. Putting things in perspective, I can't stress this enough. There's help out there, but just because your child is struggling today, don't go down that rabbit hole that they're not going to ever be okay, that this is how the rest of their life is going to be. I have never met a child that hasn't struggled. It's opportunities for us to teach them how to struggle. And the more we take care of ourselves and the more we get support, the better able we're going to be able to do some of these things for our kids and for our families. So we talked about this briefly in the last one, being aware of your own reactions, being aware of even kind of our tone. I always joke, if you've ever yelled at your child or gotten into a huge power struggle with them, did you walk away feeling like it was helpful, or did you just become frustrated and think, okay, that was really dumb? I know at least I have. setting goals, but when our kids, whether they're refusing school, whether they're maybe they're not doing something that we want them to do, maybe they're avoiding social situations, maybe they're staying in the room. Some kids will go in the room and they'll hibernate in the room all day and night, and they'll be playing on their electronics. We want to kind of look at what concerning behaviors we're seeing. If there's things we want to change, there are ways to change them. A lot of parents will say they feel like they can't set limits and expectations because they worry it'll make the child's mental health worse. They'll worry that the child is going to be more angry. This is true. It will be worse in the beginning. If you haven't set a lot of limits, or you haven't had consistent expectations, and you have a child that has behavioral issues, or maybe, I see this a lot with video game addiction and cell phone addiction, be mindful that it might get worse before it gets better. I think I have an example here, but, for instance, expectations can be, I had a kid that was too anxious to eat at the dinner table with family. And so the parent said, I'm not going to tell you have to. And I always say to kids, you have a choice. You can come down and sit with us at dinner. And if you choose not to, this is what's going to happen. If you choose not to come out of your room, you're supposed to be downstairs between 3 and 6 every day, then you're not going to be able to have the video game system in your room. If you don't go to school, we're not going to have, and the reason, and a lot of kids will say this is they're being punitive, but it looks at, we don't want to kind of get into that emotional battle with kids. You don't want to yank them out of bed. You don't want to scream and yell at them. We're all going to do that too, but realistically, it's going to be more helpful to have some kind of structure and routine in the home. It's hard to do. If you haven't done it, just start with one thing. And even if the child's anxious, and typically kids will struggle, with school anxiety on Mondays because they struggle with transitions because they need so much structure. Having the expectations on a piece of paper, on the fridge, somewhere in the home, having multiple copies because they may tear them up, can be really helpful. And all the kids I work with are genuinely amazing kids. But, when they have emotional stuff going on, when they have anxiety, they learn how to avoid. And some of them do turn to video games. Some of them turn to being obsessed with their cell phone, different things, which make it a little bit worse. Kids with anxiety are more prone to tech addiction. So you might have a child that you're having a hard time moving away from some of that stuff. And you might even see that they might really ramp up when you start to limit those things. But as you stay consistent, it will get better. These are just some coping strategies that we use at the center. I use myself. The two I like the best are kind of recognizing what is the evidence, what's the fact versus what's my assumption, what's my judgment, such as it was a terrible day versus what happened. And then my other favorite one is behave your way into feeling better. I visualize how I want the next 15 or 20 minutes to go. And I literally try to just behave my way into that ending. So find out what works for you. Find out what makes it worse. For me, I have to have time away from my cell phone because I can't really distress unless I'm away from tech a little bit. And, getting outside and exercise for me is important. Remember, our kids are going to be, most of our kids are resilient. They're going to be okay. Take a step back, ask them things like, what do you think you can do versus giving them suggestions. Most of the things our kids are asking us, they know how to do. They're just nervous about doing it. So allowing them, some kids will even have a success journal where they'll, try something new every day and kind of journal. So when they're stuck on something, you can go back and see, okay, you tried that, how did that work? That works great with elementary age, some middle school. Every day, celebrate something that went well and something that didn't. Celebrate the failures as much as the successes. I think many of our kids need to learn that it's okay to fail. We just have to bounce back. You might, have a game that you played and it didn't go well, but how do you bounce back? Allowing our kids to have all emotions, happiness, sad, anger, all of them. Our kids aren't supposed to just be content and happy. They're supposed to learn how to manage all different kinds of emotions. And that's kind of how most of us grew up. as always, there's a lot of professional help out there. Contact your school counselors, contact, us, whoever is would be helpful for you. But if you have any of these concerns with your child, help is easier to get now than ever. You can do it from the comfort of your own home. There's telehealth now. There's so many different things. You can even kind of check in and just say, I'm not sure I should be concerned, but I want to kind of get a handle on this. And this is just before we close. Many schools have school counselors, school social workers. It's a little bit different than an outside provider. And so, when there's a school counselor or a school social worker, definitely partner with them. But if the issues go a little bit beyond that, you might want to reach out for, family counseling or individual counseling. If you have a child that has behaviors you're concerned about, and your child refuses to go, then I would suggest the parents go, because I have many kids that refuse at first, or they say no, even if they're in that defiant stage. And I meet with the parents a couple times. There are a lot of lists of counselors. I would talk to your pediatrician or your school. I know if you live in McHenry County, the McHenry County Mental Health Board has a list too. There are a lot of different resources. There's also and sometimes you want to go by your insurance too. And there's also hospital programs. If you've tried counseling and now it's kind of escalated, they have IOP and day programs for children and adolescents as well. This is our podcast. I know I gave you all a lot of information. Hopefully this was helpful. If you have any follow-up questions for me, feel free to contact. It's pretty easy to find me. And I look forward. I so appreciate all of your participation. It was super helpful. Thank you, Denise. And if you all have any follow-up questions, I will, and you want to put it on, I will stand for a little bit if you have any questions you want to ask me or anything like that.
It comes through in the chat. You're getting some thank yous.
It was a lot of information.
It was, but super, super important. Great stuff. Okay, so it says we need you in our schools leading this. Maybe you can see some of the chat here. Somebody did ask how to cope with a panic attack. I don't know if you've got any good resources for that. That might be, yes. I don't know if it's more of some of the tips you've already provided, Jackie, or.
It's very, so panic attacks can be hard to identify, recognize with our children. Sometimes we will call them panic attacks, and they're not always panic attacks. Panic attacks traditionally last a really short amount of time and they're acute. But we focus on, not overreacting, working with them on breathing. What I see a lot happen is children will be really upset. Parents will kind of say something and they will almost go into a mini rage. And I often hear that called a panic attack. And that's totally different depending on, and you can watch the video from, if you didn't attend the last seminar where we talked about that emotional development. And some kids really struggling with emotional regulation, depending on where they were emotional in terms of their emotional maturity. But true panic attacks, a child really has to learn just to sit with it until it passes, focusing on their breathing, focusing on where to sit and things like that is going to be more helpful. You don't want the child running around. You don't want to be doing a lot of talking to them. You don't want to be kind of going at that. You want to give them a couple minutes and really just letting them calm down. But so often if you have the child that's running around the house or running after you, that's probably not necessarily a panic attack. That's probably them just really getting upset. And again, as a parent, we want to kind of stay calm and co-regulate with them and really and I'll often say, we're not going to talk until you've calmed down. And they might get upset, but that works for me every time. When you kind of focus on your breathing and calm down, and when they're back to that rational state, then I will engage in a conversation with them.
Thank you for that. Somebody else has put a resource, an alternative to CBT in the chat if anybody is interested.
Test anxiety is another one I saw.
Okay. Yes.
Just
test. Yes.
Tips for test anxiety. And that is it's kind of a loaded question, but a lot of times I really work with, the child one on kind of what their expectations are for the test. Because a lot of times it's fear of making mistakes, fear of failure. We even practice making mistakes. We practice getting things wrong on tests, but I work with them on grounding skills, 5 senses and breathing skills before the test, kind of how they sit before the test. Even nighttime and morning routine can help, because sometimes, not studying the morning of, if you have a lot of test anxiety, maybe reviewing it for 5 minutes. But kids with academic anxiety, a lot of times will use time limits on how much they're studying, because sometimes they have a tendency to overstudy, and that can make it worse too. I think we are good.
Makes sense. All right. So we're at just a couple minutes after 8. So I just wanted to thank Jackie for sharing your insights and expertise with us tonight, and to thank everybody who joined the call. There is a question somebody's asking about the previous session. So just so everybody here knows, we do put the recording and the presentations out in English and Spanish through the district newsletter, the Focus on 47 newsletter. So that'll be coming out next week. We should have it ready by then. If not, it will be the following week. So either the 21st or the first Tuesday of March. So anyway, I just wanted to thank everybody for joining us again tonight. And our 4th and final virtual parenting session with Jackie will be held Wednesday, March 15th at 7 p.m. again via Zoom. And the topic for that session will be parenting with a growth mindset. So again, thanks for joining us, everybody. And a special thanks to you, Jackie. Have a great night.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye.